Hello and welcome to Future Building. I'm Mathew Aitchison and I'm Professor at Monash University and CEO of Building 4.0 CRC. In this podcast, we take a broad look at buildings and building in contemporary society and what's coming down the pipeline in the future. We'll talk with invited guests and experts in the field, where we'll cover news and trends along with research and developments in the industry. Future Building is proudly sponsored by Building 4.0 CRC. Think about how buildings are currently produced. And for the sake of my argument, let's make that building an 8-story apartment building in a city. Perhaps the developer starts with an idea or a piece of land. They'll engage a team of consultants who look after the design, planning, and the engineering. While early ideas are being developed, the financial aspects of the development project are being worked up in parallel, often with a back and forth between the design teams and the finance team in order to make the building stack up. When developed to a higher degree of detail, the building might then be submitted for permitting approvals. At this point, a sales team might start pre-selling all the apartments in the project with the aim of being able to sell all of them before a shovel ever hits the site. When the approvals process is in hand, which can often be really lengthy, the team then turn their attention to getting it built. At this stage, the project goes out to tender with construction companies who pore over the documentation provided to come up with the most accurate price estimate and quotation. But wait, there's more. Once the contractor has been selected, the build phase begins. Teams are built, materials ordered, schedules made, and then the fun begins. Because most projects these days go over time, over budget, and contain all kinds of uncertainties. Why? Because most of the building will be made from scratch, on site, hopefully with the best team available to execute it, but not always. Eventually, after all of this building activity comes to a close, the developer takes possession of the building and hands it over to the final owners. Of course, some defects are found, warranties called in, and after a period of time, the owner's corporation will take over the enduring management of the building in perpetuity. Well, does that sound complex? Does it sound stressful? Does it sound unpredictable? Yes, and of course, the answer is yes. And yet, this is the way that most housing is built around the world. It's the way that most buildings are built around the world. So now I'd ask you to imagine a seamless digital experience where the developer could literally go online, enter their requirements, and after a completely predictable period, be the proud new owners of a building which is made to the highest quality for a comparable cost in record time. And I might throw in, it will be more sustainable than anything else on the market. Does this sound enticing? Well, of course it does. In today's episode, I talk with the co-founder and CTO of Gropyus, Philipp Erler. Gropyus is a company founded on the belief that a full disruption of the industry is not only possible, but necessary. It is the fully integrated file-to-factory-to-site model that characterizes Gropyus and why it has risen to some renown within building innovation circles. But creating a new building startup is not an easy thing. The path to the future that Gropyus are seeking is also paved with many previous failures of other companies, which makes today's interview a particular treat for innovation enthusiasts. Philipp studied business in Germany and then became a software engineer before starting a fintech company called Kontoblick. From 2010 to 2019, Philipp expanded his tech background with Zalando, a retail platform, where he, as you will hear, was CIO and SVP of technology and product, and eventually becoming SVP of digital experience. Just a couple of highlights from our talk today include the relationship between hardware and software, physical and digital in building, and how that can impact investment, particularly in building startups. Also, the judgment call required between staying the course in a startup, sticking to the product market fit, but also learning when to stop and listen to feedback from clients and others. And finally, I found Philipp's point around the culture of building and the challenges of integrating new ways of working from the auto industry or from the tech industry to be completely fascinating, something that I hope we get to come back to in the future. I really hope you enjoy our interview. I spoke with Philipp from his office in Berlin in July 2024. Philipp, welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be here.
Great to have you. I'd like to get started today by talking a little bit about your background. You studied business and then you moved on to tech industries. And before we get to Gropyus, your company or the company that you co-founded, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about how this background prepared you to go into business and particularly building a startup.
Sure. Like about 20 years ago, I studied a business typical MBA. However, even before that, like quite early on, I dove into working with computers. So back in the old days where you couldn't order them online, my father got the wrong one when we still had the big platform wars, and I just started to, or I got this as a hand-me-down because he couldn't give it back, and started to dabble with it, and out of some serendipity, I guess, I ended up programming and not playing games, and this started a lifelong passion for creating digital things. And then after I studied business, I went back to the tech industry, and then over the years, founded a company, worked for quite a couple of startups, and about 2010, I joined a back then fledgling small startup in the e-commerce space. Zalando. And over the years, like a year after I joined, took over the tech team and then built it out from about 20 to 2,500 people. By today, Zalando is one of the biggest tech companies in Europe. And that's essentially what I've built there. Lots of machine learning, lots of automation. And at some point in time, when companies get bigger, people with more of an entrepreneurial itch feel the urge to do something again. And that was about the time when I was thinking about what to do next. And that's essentially when the idea for Gropyus came around. Thinking about an industry that is pretty broken and needs in need for some change. And then thinking about how can we deploy my co-founders learnings from another industry to this industry as well.
Well, that's a great segue to Gropius itself. I wanted to just give you an opportunity to describe in your own words what Gropius is and perhaps what it isn't, or what's different about Gropius than, say, other companies that you're aware of.
I mean, Gropyus is a company that's essentially in the space of prefabricated housing. We focus on creating multi-family buildings from prefabricated parts with a clear eye both on sustainability and affordability. So on one hand, we're focusing very strictly on the carbon footprint of our buildings, on renewable materials, to create something that's essentially lessening or reducing the burden of construction real estate on our climate. On the other hand, what's really important to us to do this at scale, to have the utmost impact. Thus, a very, very close eye on cost and on creating something that really works in the mass market is crucial for us. We have taken a path that sets us a bit apart from other prefabricated or prefabrication companies. At the core, and it's built a bit on particular on my digital experience, at the core, there's a full digital value chain that's fully geared towards creating individual buildings. We believe, and it's particularly in the European market with all its land plots that have been formed over more or less a millennium, we believe that type buildings that always look the same don't really work. And that's also a clear signal we get from the market. With the system, the value chain, the production platform we have created over the past years, we're able to deliver buildings that fit any plot of land very well. So essentially helping real estate developers or asset holders to create buildings that have very high commercial yield on that given plot of land, which in the end requires creating buildings that are individual to this plot of land. And that's essentially what we do, right? It's a full value chain, including like the development of our building system, development of a lot of software, but also the development of a quite, let's say, um, a production platform that's quite far ahead of what you could buy today in the market, very much software driven and to some extent already AI driven to create something that's just extremely efficient, but still like industrially efficient, but still yields individual buildings.
So Gropyus was founded in 2019, if my research has been correct. And I just wanted to ask how the context that was existing in 2019 when you and Marcus started the business has changed. I'm thinking about COVID, and I'm also thinking about the housing crisis.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, when we started in 2019 was essentially the end, and unbeknownst to about everyone in the market, the end of a golden era of real estate, with very high land prices, and in the end, construction supply not being able to meet demand of real estate developers at all. So prices were up there, in the air, and that was, of course, a great start for a company that wants to provide more supply in the construction market. And then a couple of things hit first COVID with supply chain issues, particularly these were the biggest parts that drove up prices, made our pricing a bit more difficult at that point in time. Not that difficult for us. We coped quite well with also all the lockdowns and everything that happened over here. The bigger issue was really what happened, like it was essentially the effect of the Russian war on Ukraine. First, of course, the essentially insecurity everywhere in the market. No one knew in the beginning how this would pan out, and then the price hikes in real estate or the interest rate hikes in real estate financing that made most of the projects that had brought close to construction start before overnight unviable from a business point of view, right? If you have very high land prices and then high interest rates, the calculations fell apart. That has been quite challenging in the market. Also, essentially the let's say the worsened appetite for venture financing in this time, that has been quite challenging for us. On the other hand, for the same reason, the population of Germany has essentially increased by another 2 million people. We've got a lot of refugees from the Ukraine, and let's say the usual influx from other countries as well, which puts our housing, let's say the available housing, under even more strain than it was before. If you look from a very high level perspective, Germany would not have a housing crisis, but we have an ongoing urbanization, right? So I think that's similar to other countries in the world, or most developed countries, particularly in all the larger or major cities, but also minor cities. Housing is extremely scarce, and this has accelerated over the past 2-3 years, particularly due to the Ukraine war. While at the same time, new construction has become, let's say, more expensive, more difficult. We're currently the market is, or let's say, in the past 12 months to 18 months, the market has been extremely difficult. We're seeing now that it lightens up, it gets better, and like the construction supply has shrunken even more, right? And particularly if we start to rebuild Ukraine, this will put an additional strain on the whole construction industry in Europe. Which honestly takes or creates great prospects for a company that's working in prefab with a dramatically higher efficiency when it comes to labor.
Yeah. Look, I was doing some research a couple of weeks ago, looking at different countries around the world, and in particular the UK and Germany. And I'm not sure if you can validate this research, but the annual target in Germany for new housing required is around 400,000 per year. And and I saw a figure that said that Germany is expected to get close to 210,000 housing units this year in 2024.
Yeah, yeah, that's still a spillover from the good years. So in the good years, like first half of this decade, or maybe second half of last decade as well, Germany was able, or the construction industry in Germany was able to always build around 220, 230,000 apartments. We are now still looking at 210. That's a spillover effect of those years where projects were still in the making. When we look rather into next year or the year thereafter, we're looking rather at 170,000, 160,000. That's, of course, increasing the gap because it's 400 each year, right? It's not 400 we have to deliver, 400,000 we have to deliver once, 400 each year. So by each year, the gap widens by about 200 plus thousand apartments. It is a pretty crazy situation. It's also, I mean, I'm living in Berlin. If you need to find a flat over here, it takes you months, and you're really lucky to take whatever you get, right? There's a very, very tiny premium market that works as always. Everything else has come to a grinding halt.
Yeah, interesting. Look, this is the research that we were doing was just taking a couple of the big economies, and it shows that really this issue is widespread. This is not a German problem. It's also not just an Australian problem. It's a US, Australian, UK, Germany, Canada. It expands everywhere. So I think a company like yours that comes along and can radically boost productivity is very, very valuable. Um, I do want to move into a slightly deeper dive series of sections now. And the first one is really about what it is to have a startup in the building industry and how you scale that up. So I wonder if you could just explain to us where you are at on the growth
I
journey.
mean, the other day I explained it a bit like this. You know, when you look at the startup, there these early months or years, depends on how complex your business model is, where you take your idea and you're building the cornerstones. You're essentially laying down the foundation, the initial ideas of your tech, and you implement it and you show that it works. That's the if you get enough financing on your idea, that's the happy time essentially, right? It feels tedious, but it's after now having built a couple of startups, that's the happy time because you're essentially the only thing you're building against is your ability to fundraise on your idea. And then at some point in time, you hit the market and hopefully find product market fit, and then scale your business. And after that, at some point in time, you of course, I mean, you hopefully grow over quite a nice time, and then but things become more stable. What we are currently between this first phase of building a company, and the second phase of really validating product market fit through scaling. It's something I would describe as the twilight zone because it's, I mean, at that point in time, you're a bit in an area where you spend quite a lot of money, and you're essentially building on a lot of bets you've made, but you're really, I mean, usually you're really struggling or hustling hard to get into the market, to get your first, in our case now, first projects. If it would be something fully digital, your first customers, first large contracts, whatever. And it's Churchill once said, in totally different context, the darkest hour. And for a startup, this is the darkest hour, right? It's really the one like you've invested for quite some time, money, energy, a lot of love, blood, sweat, and tears, um, and it's now, yeah, things are now getting real, and that's where we are. We have our first larger projects, and we have built a building in 2022. It's essentially our apprentice piece where we showed that we can actually build. But now it's really going into building repeatedly against this holy triangle of cost, quality, and time. And that's essentially the time that's now starting with our first external project starting in a few weeks. It's pretty large. It's about 116 units, 12,000 square meters gross floor area. A nice project, also in a let's say good location in southern Germany. This is where everything will now come, or everything will hit the road. Like, and we will really have to demonstrate that we can do this against all the calculations, all the plans, all the simulations we've done, and that we're able to deliver a set in this in cost, in time, and in quality. It's going to be exciting, but it's also a bit daunting, honestly, because it's now the time where all your thoughts and all your, like, all the plans you've made need to show if they're true or not. And that's about where we are right now.
That's fantastic because, for listeners, when we first spent some time together, it was because you'd traveled to Australia to speak at our annual conference, and one of the themes that you and I spoke quite a bit about over that week, Philip, was around the topic of how to sustainably grow a startup in the building industry, because there have been quite a few spectacular failures. There's a lot of what one might call unsolicited advice out there on LinkedIn and other platforms about people telling you how to do it. I wanted to get your view on this as someone who's been in the trenches. How do you grow sustainably a building startup? Is there anything you can learn, and what's it been like living under the shadow of Katera, trying to raise money in that environment?
Good question. Yeah, how to build a startup sustainably. I mean, in the end, this would be a lot easier if it was fully digital, right? Because your investments, in a particular CapEx investment, your investment into actual hardware, those large sums we have to spend on the factory we've acquired in 2020, and where we built about half a kilometer of automation technology. These investments are huge, and they don't allow you to go in small pieces. If you go, or in small steps, if you would build this fully, or would have the chance to build this fully digitally, you could take very small steps and control your investments um, in a much more detailed way, which always helps to do something small and then learn, course correct. It's a lot more difficult if you go into the building sector with something that involves hardware. Um, what we've done just because steel is expensive and robots are expensive, and in the end we're spending way north of 50 million euros just on the hardware alone, and like fitting out the factory, um, to then produce on our large scale automation from the end of this year onwards. What we've done to mitigate essentially the risk of doing something that might prove completely wrong later, you can never fully mitigate that, but you can take steps towards that. In the end, systematize everything you do, right? To always break it down into individual pieces, into systems where you can validate individual parts, and where you, on one hand, individual steps. For example, we've over the course of the last year, before this large automation is in place, we've set up a small manual manufacturing setup, which already operates on the same digital stack. With that, we can validate the digital stack way before, so all the software integration, all the data integration, way before the large scale expensive automation is in place. And this essentially reduces the risk of running into any unpleasant surprises once the big hardware is powered up. Lots of these steps are really crucial to think about your project management. You would say your work breakdown structure, breaking down all the different pieces you need to build your business, and think about how can we validate those earlier. That's one big thing. And another big thing is, we are very proud to have Europe's biggest asset holder with Vonovia as a shareholder. They are also one of the biggest real estate developers, build a lot of stuff for their own book. This of course helps. Close collaboration with them helped us a lot over the last 12 years to prepare for product market fit. Because I mean, if you're the biggest potential customer that would be out there in the market, if this customer is close to you, that's of course very helpful, because even if you don't build yet with them, because they also had their problems during the real estate crunch, you can still already tap into their knowledge, and it's vast knowledge, and this really helps you to build product market fit. And in the end, particularly in the building industry where processes take quite, or the learning cycles are quite long, just due to the reality of physics, right? Building buildings, and it takes longer than just creating a small digital feature, throw it out in the market, and you learn into within a few hours. Or back in the back in the old days at Zalando, it took us minutes to learn if something works, just because we had so much traffic. That's something you have to deal with. So that things take this much longer, and you have to very meticulously think about what's my testing strategy, if you will. How do I validate any ideas early on to ensure I'm not investing into the wrong pieces? And that's something which gave us quite a lot of learnings, right? This we initially, like everyone else, started with a few type buildings that were always similar, very efficient to produce, had very nice floor plans. Through the collaboration with, particularly with Vonovia, but also like a very close ear on the market, it became very clear to us, and it's, I think, the biggest learning we had over the past 5 years. Right? You cannot win this market at scale with buildings that always look the same. Just it's very simple. In capitalist societies, land has a value, and this value needs to be distributed over the lettable area or the sellable area. So the more sellable area you get onto that plot of land, the better the equation works, right? It's a very simple equation. Learning that was really crucial for us, and it really helps us to win projects now for the year 25 and 26 and onwards.
Great. Well, maybe just briefly touch on that point I raised about raising money. And
In the shadow of Katara.
yeah, in the shadow of Katera. And clearly it's not been too difficult, because if I'm not mistaken, you've just received a very large investment from the European Investment Bank of around 40 million euro, if I've got that correct. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. I mean, over the past 5 years, we raised close to €250 million. However, it hasn't been easy, right? It has been extremely hard. Europe is not necessarily a great place to raise for asset-heavy startups. For industries, it works really well. If you're, like, I don't know, in the car industry or the chip industry or wherever, and you need a lot of support financially, that's rather easy to get in Europe, as long as you can show a track record of 30 plus years. Startup sphere in Europe is a lot more difficult than, for example, in the US, and particularly if you want to raise for asset heavy, as in our case, businesses. So it has been quite difficult to raise this money. Particularly my co-founder is doing a great job here, and always tapping into sources no one imagined before. The European Investment Bank is a great validator. They have the likely hardest due diligence process on earth, because it's actually not a bank; it's a public authority, just disguised with the name bank. So that their due diligence processes are extremely excruciating. That worked well with a lot of hard work. This topic of Katera is, of course, always coming up, right? In every single discussion with a new investor who is at least a little bit knowledgeable, the question of Katera comes up. It's always the same question. It's, okay, they tanked with a lot of glory and with an enormous amount of money they raised. What are you doing different? From our point of view, two companies are not even close, right? We take and we're very proud of it. We have a very strong focus on one product and on this fully integrated end-to-end value chain. One product, to not defocus ourselves, to not run after every new idea quickly, and the end-to-end integration to make sure everything works and you're not, I don't know, create that's essentially the two big problems of Katera, right? They worked on a lot of different things, wanted to solve a lot of different problems, from Amazon warehouses to real, like, residential, and residential also in a lot of different flavors. And the second thing is to really make sure that once you build a pipeline, you're able to deliver it, because you only have one shot. You cannot go out there and tell people you're the biggest cool next thing after sliced bread, and then you're not able to deliver. And thus, focusing on these two topics is really crucial for us. That's something we tell everyone, sometimes even proactively, just to get this out of the system or their system. But it's not necessarily helpful. And this also has a bit of a side effect, right? We have in European or another, the medal has another side. We have in Europe, there are a couple of companies that are investing heavily in prefab. We really root for every single one of them because the market cannot afford a second Katera. So that's and this leads honestly also to a bit of actually to a very nice amicable situation in the sphere of prefab companies, because we talk a lot and because everyone fears that there is another Katera happening. We talk a lot and sometimes even help each other send over projects that might fit another one better. That might be the positive outcome of the Katera situation.
That's great. So maybe turning a bit closer to the actual offering now to talk about the sustainability credentials. You mentioned at the top that there's two big problems that, well, there's many problems that Gropyus is clearly solving, but the affordability issue is the one, and the other being sustainability. So, for the benefit of those people who didn't get the pleasure of coming to our conference last year, you did say that building is one of the few industries that can become climate positive. Can I just get you to unpack that statement and sort of lay out some of the data that surrounds the sustainability credentials of Gropius?
Yeah, of course. I mean, in the end, this statement is built very much around, pun intended, buildings offering a lot of real estate for particularly for energy generation. We are trying, and this always depends a bit on what the customer, also like our real estate developer or an asset holder, wants to invest upfront. And we're trying to always create buildings that are fully energy positive. And with that, I mean, or put differently, with focusing a lot on reducing gray carbon matter in our buildings, so the carbon that's spent during the construction phase or the harvesting phase or creation phase of the materials. That's focus number one, and to bring this down as much as possible. Our first building was already 22%, had a 22% lower initial carbon footprint than the reference building of the German respective authority that's used here for assessing buildings. Our current, like the second generation of our building system we're producing currently, is already at roughly 40% less. And then if you use the space on the building to create energy, mostly photovoltaics, sometimes wind turbines, but in most cases it's solar panels, and you use it wisely in a building that needs a lot less energy to heat or cool over the year, there's the possibility to create more energy and give more energy back to the grid than you would ever need. That's works already with our first building. So out of the, I said, initial gray carbon, as we call it over here, it's 22% less. When you take an operational, the operational carbon throughout the life cycle, the building is at 95% less. Its carbon footprint or life cycle carbon footprint is 95% less than reference building. So it's very tiny. Its impact on climate is very tiny. This means that every single tenant that lives in the building, just by living there, saves about a ton of CO2 equivalents every year. That's about 15% compared to the German market, like the German average, which is around 7.7 tons per capita per annum. With our new, or with the iterated building system, based on location and based on the fit out with solar panels, we sometimes also put them in facades. We're able to already go below zero. In that case, the building is, because it's essentially replacing energy generation from, I don't know, coal plants and whatever. So that's a positive effect, and that's something we want to drive further, because in that case, you're then not only reducing the carbon footprint of people living in there, but you're helping to change the overall equation of the market. And that's something, even in I mean, for those of you who have been to Germany, there are a few summer months where we actually get quite a lot of sun and solar works, but in about 8 to 9 months of the year, solar isn't great in Germany because it's just so far up north, right? In places where you got more sun, the equation would be even better. And that's for us is really a key driver to create these energy positive buildings. It comes a bit with a weird side effect, because the biggest carbon offender we have in gray carbon, so in the initial phase, is by now actually the solar panel. But that's, I guess, the price we have to pay there.
That's a price we're paying everywhere. So no, that's really fascinating. I want to go also into this issue of the specifics of your business that is around digital and physical, software and hardware, and also what it is to have factories. So I understand that you've got a new factory coming online. It's set up to be able to produce 4,000 apartments per year. That's units of apartments, obviously not apartment blocks. Um, you spoke earlier about the uh, product market fit and the lessons that Gropyus had learned around flexibility and utilizing as much of that parcel of land as possible, and some of the issues that were arising perhaps between using more um, inflexible typologies on sites. What is it about the rigor of sticking to a specific product and market? And, you spoke about that as well in relation to Katera. Why is that necessary, and how hard is it?
The thing is, if you build something that's bigger, where you have these high investments, you're in a bit of a different situation than, I don't know, a small team of 5 people that has a very small financial footprint and can move quickly and can opportunistically pursue quite a lot of different things until you hit the one thing that really works well. If you're in a space where your capital invest, or the capital spent on actual hardware, lead times, also lead times of your customer projects are quite long, just because that's how the industry, in most cases also physics, work. The risk, on the one hand, the risk of doing the wrong thing are quite aggravated, because the effect, there's just a very strong ripple effect, right? If the one thing you're starting does not work out, you're maybe not wasted, but you've spent quite a lot of money on something that doesn't work, and essentially wasted it there. So that's something you really want to make sure that that's not happening. This also means, particularly in an industry that's thousands of years old, and the construction industry is not necessarily stupid, right? They know how to build. They produce buildings that last centuries. They produce buildings that also deliver a okayish quality, and particularly if you work with a good company, quality is actually pretty great. So you're not operating in a market where your product is completely novel. It's just a way you create your product, which is novel. And that means there's a strong, how to call that, a strong reference you're working against. And if you're not meeting that reference, your business doesn't work out, right? And thus really focusing on getting one thing right, which takes a lot of work, taking very deliberate decisions also on what not to do, is really crucial. And on the other hand, and it's a good part of your question, it's actually very hard. Because particularly if you do things for, in our case, you prepare essentially for 5 years for this twilight zone. Once you get into the market and fit, there's always questions you ask yourself, or others ask you, okay, couldn't you also do, I don't know, single family homes, or this or that? or change things. And sometimes you need to listen, and you need, in the end, I think the key thing is to figure out when to listen, and when to say, well, that's great, but we have to keep our heads down. We have to get this one thing right. Yeah, you need to listen because you never know whether this one thing is the right thing. That's why you need to listen. But on the other hand, the conviction to also bring the one thing you're working on to a level that's really like the market is excited with, and a level people will buy from you, is something that's not done while you do 20 other things in parallel, right? And particularly if you build a factory.
And I think as well, Philip, as you were mentioning before, there's a long cycle time in our industry, right? Because we're not making, a new button on some interface that you click and it triggers a software routine. These things take a long time, and I've seen many companies personally that they've probably listened too much to take your language, meaning, oh, now let's do retirement villages, and now let's do single family houses, and now we'll do, very tall buildings, and moving around between different building typologies in ways that before that actually resolved and had fully functioning products in markets that actually chosen. So that long cycle time that you were referring to before can really thwart that. And so it's yeah, it's going to be obviously very fascinating to see you roll this out in a larger scale with the buildings that you're talking about. I want to come back to another thing, Philip, that you were discussing, because there's been, shall we call it, an orthodoxy in some business circles, I think, around asset light versus asset heavy, as you mentioned before, about the relationship between digital and physical. And I heard Airbnb talking on a podcast a year or so ago, and the CEO of that company was bragging, "Oh, we don't pour any concrete. We don't pour any concrete. We just use buildings that other people make." You'd never get into that because you'd have to be making physical assets. And so, on the one hand, you have that approach at the moment, but on the other hand, we've also lived through the successes of Tesla and understood that getting software and hardware exactly right can be an incredible strategy for business. And so this brings me to my question, which was around factory yield. And you and I had a little conversation, I'm not sure if you remember, around the relationship between, say, investment in auto factory versus yield relative to a building factory investment versus its specific yield. I wonder if you could unpack that, your thoughts on that a little more.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, the thing is, buildings, in our case, they're made out of parts or elements that are much less complex than modern cars. And this essentially leads to a situation where and you're looking at an industry that's automated to a very, very small degree. Thus, we're still in the early phase of, let's say, an industry transformation to an automated industry, which allows, while at the same time, I think that's important, while at the same time you can build on a lot of the advancements that haven't been made in other industries in terms of automation for 100+ years, right? This puts particularly the building industry in a very specific situation, or that's our view on it. And you can create factories that actually have an extremely high yield compared to others, right? If you, for example, I don't know, Volkswagen or Daimler or BMW or one of the German car companies, of course, come up with a new model and they have retooled their production lines and rebuilt them. It's usually building out the, let's say, a production line for a new car that then yields 100,000 cars a year. It's easily 1.5, 2 billion euros that is spent on that. And then you're making in the end an annual turnover of, be it 2.5 million, just because the steps required are extremely complex. In our case, the elements we produce, I mean, we're working with a prefabrication ratio of more than 90%, so electrical, windows, blinds, ventilation systems, what else? These are already part of, already installed in factory automatically, not by humans, installed automatically. So it's a very high level of prefabrication. On site, there's very little to do to complete the building. However, the investment for such a factory is rather in the area of around 50 million euros, but you're doing an annual turnover with these 4,000 apartments, European market prices, of course, now, that's around 500 million, so a factor of 1 to 10 instead of 1 to 1 or 1 to 2. This is pretty much due to the state of automation, which has advanced a lot, and is now meeting an industry that is, as I said, automated to a very small degree. So it's a bit of a, we think it's a super nice sweet spot to do this right now, because we can build on the, and that's something we also do internally. So we have in our company, we have more people from the automotive and tech, like by far automotive and tech sector, than from the actual construction industry. We need, of course, the colleagues from the construction industry to be able to build something and to design a great building system. But much more effort is spent on the production and like on producing it. And as I said, we are now at this point where we can use all this experience that has been built over the past 100 years in other industries and bring it to this industry with a very nice ratio of essentially produced revenue over the necessary capital investment. But it's of course something you would never do for one project. You can only do this if you really build this for scale, right? If you do this for one project, it's totally killing you. And that's, I think, also what keeps the industry back. And also the car industry didn't do this overnight, right? It took them 20, 30 years to get from the first, I don't know, carriages with a small engine, Mr. Benz built, or Carl Benz built, to what Henry Ford did, and then later on the large automated lines from the 50s, 60s onwards.
That's a really interesting point you raise around the people involved in your venture. You mentioned you had a lot more people from auto and tech, and of course, you've got people from construction. I get that. How has that changed the culture in your view, Philip?
Yeah, that's one of the hardest parts, honestly. I mean, there's particularly like people from the construction industry. Those people are coming more from manufacturing and automation and the car industry. And then third group, everyone coming from rather from a tech background. These three cultures, and we're of course looking for people who have been successful before, so they've ingrained some of the culture of these industries. They're completely incompatible from the get-go. That's been one of the hardest things we had to solve for, is to bring these three cultures together. I mean, in the end, the car industry is somewhere in the middle, having or the automation industry, very rigid plans where everything is detailed out to the very last bit, and then you follow them rigidly. You have people from the construction industry where there's always the option and you solve things on site, right? So getting things to 100% in engineering is very difficult there. On the other hand, you have the tech industry that's more, okay, if we can't solve it today, we'll solve it tomorrow, but we'll somehow make it happen. Bringing all those three together has been one of the hardest things. Maybe aside of fundraising, we had to get done, or had to master over the past 5 years.
That's excellent. Well, maybe in our next podcast, because I hope there will be a next one, we'll get you to tell everyone the secret of integrating those three cultures.
Oh, I wish. I wish I knew that.
Well, maybe by then you will. Yeah. So, moving a little bit to wrap up now, Philip, I guess I'm really interested to hear from your perspective what's next. I know this might feel like a strange question. You mentioned before about where you are at in the journey. You're in the building phase, and now you're validating and you're scaling up. You're growing the size of the the demonstration buildings, getting new jobs through the door, building factories. But what can you say about what the next big challenge is for Gropius?
Yeah, so earlier for us, the big challenge is to get out of this twilight zone and to deliver this business model on a repeated, like in a scalable way and repeatedly, and really show that this business model actually works and that it provides better buildings at lower cost. That's what's ahead of us. The next 2 years will be extremely exciting to show this first in the German market, and then also, I think that's obvious at some point in time. Also look beyond the, let's say, the German-speaking markets, i.e., Germany, Austria, Switzerland, on where this product would fit well, and where this approach would also work. Finding good models for that. That's then again somewhere between asset heavy and asset light. Might not always be us building a factory, but maybe providing the technology. These topics will become really crucial for us over the next 24 months, I guess.
Yeah, great. My final question is really a crystal ball type question, Philip, and I can't think of anyone better to ask, but I'm really interested to see what you think is coming down the pipeline of building and the building industry in the next 5 to 10 years. What does the future look like in your mind? And is it a mirror image of Gropius, or is there something else that you can foresee in our industry beyond what you've been able to create already at Gropius?
I think in addition to the topic we're working on, so industrialized efficiency and automation, digitization, there will be quite a lot, particularly in the European market, but I think that also holds true for other markets. We will see quite strong effects on the materials we use, with the whole world getting off coal and getting off fossil fuels, both liquid and hard ones. We will see quite a change in materials we use. I mean, in Germany alone, gypsum is essentially, or most of the gypsum we use is a byproduct of firing coal. There is a very clear path to get out of firing coal for energy generation, so we will also lose gypsum as one of the most important materials in all types of construction, right? At least at this, let's say, cheap availability. There will be, and this is only one effect, right? Also, when you look into, I don't know, all kinds of fixtures we create from plastics today, there is quite a lot. We will see quite a lot of changes in the next 10 to 20 years when it comes to materials, and I think that's something we're, including us, we're not super well prepared for yet. Because on the other hand, the expectation is always to deliver buildings that, at least in Europe, last hundreds of years. And I think that's the same in Australia. Right? You don't create buildings only for 20 years. That's going to be, I think, a topic the whole industry needs to put more emphasis on, or a higher. Also, when you look into materials that just take a lot of energy to produce, rock wool, for example, or like these insulation materials, we just have to figure out if we can afford this over time. That's I think one key topic. I think the whole topic of labor shortage will, particularly in the developed societies, will continue to become worse. You can solve this partially through prefabrication, but you will also, like as an industry, we will become much more collaborative and much better in reducing waste, like wasted energy that comes from people not collaborating really well on a digital sphere. So I think also in terms of digital models, there's huge potential for startups, for companies to provide better software, more collaborative software, more data-driven software to build smart buildings and smart cities. everything we do so far, or most of what we do so far, is rather geared towards exchanging or structuring information. Let's go for that. Not even exchanging information yet, right? It's always, when you look at and Revit, for example, is a great tool, but it's essentially a three-dimensional version of Excel. If you've ever worked with a few people on an Excel file, you know the fear that someone breaks a formula, and it's basically also how Revit and the other tools work, which is great, right? I don't want to criticize them on creating like Autodesk or others on creating these tools, but taking this to the next level is really geared towards reliable exchange of data, reliable collaboration. That's gonna really help the industry become more efficient also on those topics you can't prefabricate. I mean, the Eastern Europe under Soviet rule has tried to prefabricate about everything. We see across all of Eastern Europe, including Germany, that this does not last well, right? And that's something where, yeah, we'll just, I think, have to find ways to also work very effectively and very efficiently on all those projects, be it, I know, great large bridges, great opera houses, whatever, schools, where the individual, like the truly individual building, is still the pinnacle of what we want to do. Ultimately, it's still humans who want to, we're still humans who want to also somehow show off what we can do. There will also be always be lighthouse projects, but also those could become more, or the creation of those could become a lot more efficient. And that's something where I think there's a lot of potential for the industry, and particularly also for startups, to create their own playing field.
Excellent. Well, Philip, I think that's a really good point to end the discussion on. I was particularly taken at the end. I mean, I have no qualms that you will deliver on the business model that you've mentioned, better buildings at lower cost, and that you will inevitably get out of the twilight zone, which is a great title for another podcast as well. Philip, I really want to thank you for your time today. I particularly want to thank you for your frank and honest feedback. I think it's going to be really useful to a lot of our audience who are in the space of trying to start their own businesses, or they're involved in some form or other. So I really appreciate that, because I think it's very helpful to hear honest and frank assessments of what it actually takes to start a business in this space. And you guys have been extremely successful in doing that. So I would congratulate you again on that. To our audience, I want to thank you and thank Philip, obviously, for joining us. The notes and references that we've mentioned today will be added online. And until the next time, I want to thank you for listening, and thank you again, Philip, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for hosting me.